In Charleston, among towering columns and the weight of tradition, two destinies collide. Charlotte Bennett, a young law student marked by loss and solitude, sees her world turned upside down when she accepts a marriage of convenience with Gabriel Hartwell, a feared, impenetrable federal judge 20 years her senior, who swore he did not believe in love. What begins as a cold contract soon becomes a silent battle between reason and desire, until every glance and every gesture reveals a passion impossible to deny. The rain drummed against the tall windows of Judge Edward Bennett's study, each drop echoing through the mahogany-paneled room like a solemn requiem. Charlotte Bennett sat in the leather chair that had always been too large for her, watching the water cascade down the glass in rivulets that blurred the view of Charleston's historic district beyond. At 21, she possessed a composure that belied her years, her dark hair pulled back in a simple chignon that revealed the elegant line of her neck and the quiet determination in her amber eyes. The funeral had been 3 days ago. 3 days since she had stood beside her grandfather's grave, surrounded by Charleston's legal elite, all offering their condolences with the practiced sympathy of those who understood grief as a professional obligation rather than a personal devastation. She had accepted their words with grace, her spine straight, her voice steady as she thanked them for coming. No one saw her cry because she saved her tears for the solitude of this room, where the scent of her grandfather's pipe tobacco still lingered in the upholstery. Judge Edward Bennett had been more than her guardian. He had been her anchor in a world that had shown her early how easily people could disappear. Her mother had left when Charlotte was 6, walking out of their lives with nothing more than a suitcase and a note that her grandfather had never let her read. "Some people aren't built for staying," he had told her when she was old enough to ask the hard questions. "But that doesn't mean you're not worth staying for." Now he was gone too, and the weight of being truly alone pressed against her chest like a physical ache. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 5 times, its deep bronze notes reverberating through the silence. Charlotte rose from the chair, smoothing the fabric of her charcoal wool dress, the same one she had worn to the funeral, practical and understated. She moved to the massive oak desk, where legal documents lay scattered like fallen leaves, each one a reminder of how complicated her grandfather's death had made everything. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. The estate was substantial, but distant relatives had already begun circling like vultures, questioning her right to inherit everything her grandfather had worked to build. Letters from lawyers she didn't recognize filled the inbox, each one more aggressive than the last. Her grandfather's closest friend and longtime attorney, Mr. Whitmore, had been gentle but clear. Without a stronger legal position, she could lose everything. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention back to the window. A sleek, black sedan was pulling into the circular drive, its presence both expected and dreaded. Gabriel Hartwell had called that morning, his voice clipped and professional over the phone. "I need to speak with you about your grandfather's final wishes," he had said, offering no comfort, no personal words about their shared loss. Charlotte had known Gabriel for years, though known was perhaps too generous a word. He had been her grandfather's protégé, his first judicial clerk, and later his most trusted colleague. Judge Bennett had spoken of Gabriel with a pride usually reserved for family, often saying that the younger man possessed the finest legal mind of his generation. At 41, Gabriel Hartwell was already a federal judge, feared for his razor-sharp intellect and uncompromising decisions. She had seen him at various legal functions over the years, always impeccably dressed, always commanding attention without seeming to seek it. There was something almost leonine about him, the way he carried himself with quiet authority, the silver threading through his dark hair that only added to his commanding presence. But what she remembered most were his eyes, steel gray and penetrating, as if he could see through pretense to the truth beneath. The doorbell's chime was deep and resonant, echoing through the house's high ceilings. Charlotte took a steadying breath and made her way through the familiar hallways, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and towering bookcases filled with leather-bound legal volumes. When she opened the heavy front door, Gabriel Hartwell stood on the threshold like a force of nature, barely contained within the confines of a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. "Charlotte." His voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, authoritative, with the faintest trace of a southern drawl that he had never quite managed to erase despite his years in federal court. He removed his hat, revealing hair that was darker than she remembered, though the silver at his temples caught the fading afternoon light. Judge Hartwell. She stepped aside to let him enter, acutely aware of how his presence seemed to fill the spacious foyer. He was taller than she had remembered, too, with broad shoulders and an air of barely leashed power that made her suddenly conscious of how small she felt beside him. "Gabriel," he corrected, his grey eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I think we're past formalities now." She led him to her grandfather's study, watching as he took in the familiar surroundings with what might have been nostalgia, though his expression revealed nothing. He had spent countless hours in this room during his clerkship, and she wondered if being here brought back memories of the man who had shaped both their lives in different ways. "Your grandfather was more than a mentor to me," Gabriel said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. He had taken a position near the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in a stance that suggested military training, though she knew he had gone straight from law school to the clerk position. "He was the closest thing to a father I ever had." Charlotte nodded, surprised by the admission. Gabriel Hartwell was not known for personal revelations. "He spoke of you often. He was very proud of what you accomplished." Something flickered across Gabriel's features, pain perhaps or regret. "He made me promise something, Charlotte, before he died." His voice dropped lower, and she found herself leaning forward slightly to catch his words. "He made me swear to look after you with the same honor and devotion I had always shown him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze, though she couldn't have said why. "I don't need looking after," she said quietly, lifting her chin with a pride her grandfather would have recognized. "Perhaps not," Gabriel replied, his mouth curving in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "But you need protection from those who would take advantage of your situation. Your grandfather's cousins are already moving to contest the will. Without a legal guardian or—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Without a stronger legal position, you could lose everything he worked to leave you." Charlotte's throat tightened. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that all the lawyer's letters had not. "What are you suggesting?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, as if he were delivering a verdict from the bench. "Marriage, Charlotte. A marriage of convenience that would give you the legal protection you need and fulfill the promise I made to your grandfather." The words hit her like a physical blow. She sank into her grandfather's chair, her mind reeling. "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm offering you a solution," Gabriel corrected, his tone remaining professionally detached, even as something unreadable flickered in his eyes. "It would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. You would maintain your independence, continue your studies, and secure your inheritance. In return, you would have the protection of my name and position." Charlotte stared at him, searching his face for some sign of what he was truly thinking. But Gabriel Hartwell had spent years perfecting the art of revealing nothing, and his expression remained as unreadable as carved stone. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and Charlotte wondered if her grandfather had somehow foreseen this moment. Had he known that his death would set in motion events that would bind her to the man he had loved like a son? The thought should have been frightening, but instead she felt something else entirely, a strange sense of inevitability, as if this moment had been written in the stars long before either of them had been born. "I need time to think," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Gabriel nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Of course. But don't take too long, Charlotte. Your grandfather's enemies won't wait for you to be ready." As he turned to leave, Charlotte felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders, like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. But as she watched Gabriel Hartwell walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that her grandfather had orchestrated this moment, with the same careful precision he had brought to every important decision in his life. The question was whether she was brave enough to trust his judgment one final time. Charlotte spent the night pacing the polished floors of her grandfather's house, her bare feet silent against the cool hardwood as she moved from room to room like a restless spirit. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Gabriel Hartwell's steel-gray gaze, and heard his carefully controlled voice offering her a marriage that was anything but a marriage at all. Dawn broke grey and uncertain over Charleston, the morning mist rising from the harbour like ghostly fingers reaching toward the historic spires and mansions that had stood sentinel over the city for centuries. Charlotte stood at her bedroom window, still wearing the same charcoal dress from the day before, watching the world wake up around her while she grappled with a decision that would change everything. The sound of the telephone's sharp ring cut through the morning silence like a knife. Charlotte hurried downstairs, her heart racing with the absurd hope that it might be Gabriel, calling to retract his impossible offer, to tell her he had found another solution that didn't require her to bind herself to a man she barely knew. Instead, it was Mr. Whitmore, her grandfather's attorney, his usually calm voice tight with urgency. "Charlotte, my dear, I'm afraid I have troubling news. Your grandfather's cousin, Harold, has filed a formal challenge to the will. He's claiming that Edward was not of sound mind when he drafted the document, and he's demanding a full investigation of your legal guardianship." Charlotte sank into the kitchen chair, the phone cord twisting around her fingers as she absorbed the blow. Harold Bennett was a calculating man who had never shown any interest in family until money was involved. She had met him perhaps 3 times in her entire life, and each encounter had left her feeling as though she needed a shower afterward. "What does this mean?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be nothing good. "It means they're moving faster than we anticipated," Mr. Whitmore replied grimly. "Without additional legal protections, there's a real possibility they could freeze your assets pending investigation. You could lose access to everything: the house, your trust fund, even your tuition payments." Charlotte closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her carefully ordered world beginning to crumble. "How long do I have?" "Days, not weeks. Harold has hired aggressive counsel and they're pushing for an emergency hearing." Mr. Whitmore paused, and she could hear the reluctance in his voice when he continued. "Charlotte, has Judge Hartwell spoken with you about his proposal?" Heat flooded Charlotte's cheeks. Apparently Gabriel's solution was not as private as she had hoped. "He mentioned something, yes. I know it seems extreme, but it would solve your legal problems immediately. Marriage would give you an unassailable position, particularly marriage to someone of Gabriel's standing. Harold wouldn't dare challenge a federal judge's wife." After hanging up, Charlotte sat in the silent kitchen for a long time, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She thought about her grandfather, about the way he had always approached difficult decisions with methodical precision. He would have weighed every option, considered every angle, and chosen the path that best served his long-term goals. The problem was that marriage to Gabriel Hartwell felt less like a solution and more like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. By noon, Charlotte had made her decision. She dressed carefully in a navy wool suit that her grandfather had always said made her look like a proper lawyer, pinned her hair into a neat chignon, and drove through Charleston's winding streets to the federal courthouse, where Gabriel presided over cases that shaped the legal landscape of the entire Southeast. The courthouse was an imposing neoclassical building that seemed designed to intimidate, with massive columns and stone lions that guarded the entrance like sentinels. Charlotte had been here before for her grandfather's swearing-in ceremonies and various legal functions, but she had never felt quite so small as she did walking through the echoing marble halls toward Gabriel's chambers. His secretary, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, looked up from her desk with the kind of expression that suggested she ate opposing counsel for breakfast. "Judge Hartwell is in conference," she said crisply. "Do you have an appointment?" "Please tell him Charlotte Bennett is here," Charlotte replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "He'll see me." The secretary's eyebrows rose slightly, but she picked up the phone and spoke in low, respectful tones. Within moments, the heavy oak door to Gabriel's chambers opened, and he appeared in the doorway wearing judicial robes that made him look even more imposing than usual. "Charlotte." His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught something in his grey eyes that might have been surprise. "Please come in." His chambers were exactly what she had expected: dark wood paneling, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal volumes, and a massive desk that seemed to serve as both workspace and fortress. Diplomas and awards covered one wall, testament to a career built on brilliance and unwavering dedication to justice. Gabriel closed the door behind her and moved to remove his judicial robes, hanging them on a wooden stand with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. Underneath, he wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. Charlotte found herself momentarily distracted by the way the afternoon light caught the silver threading through his dark hair. "I assume Harold Bennett's legal maneuvering has reached your ears," Gabriel said, settling behind his desk and gesturing for her to take the chair across from him. "Whitmore called this morning." Charlotte nodded, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "They're moving for an emergency hearing. Mr. Whitmore says I could lose everything within days." "Harold is a fool, but he's hired competent counsel," Gabriel replied, his fingers steepled before him as he studied her face. "They know exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in your position." "And your offer still stands?" Charlotte asked, her throat suddenly dry. Something shifted in Gabriel's expression, a flicker of what might have been relief, though it was gone so quickly she couldn't be sure. "It does, but I want you to understand exactly what you would be agreeing to, Charlotte. This would be a legal arrangement, nothing more. You would live in my house, bear my name, and have the full protection of my position. In return, you would have complete freedom to pursue your education and your own interests. I would ask nothing of you beyond basic social appearances." Charlotte absorbed his words, trying to read between the lines of his carefully controlled offer. "And you? What do you get from this arrangement?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes unreadable. "The satisfaction of honoring a promise to the man who shaped my career. Your grandfather saved me, Charlotte. This is simply returning the favor." There was something he wasn't telling her. Charlotte could sense it in the careful way he chose his words, in the subtle tension that seemed to radiate from his powerful frame. But Gabriel Hartwell was not a man who revealed his secrets easily, and she suspected that whatever else motivated him would remain buried beneath layers of professional composure and personal reserve. "When?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow morning. A civil ceremony at the courthouse. No guests, no fanfare. Purely legal." Gabriel's voice remained steady, but Charlotte caught the way his fingers tightened slightly against each other. "If you're certain this is what you want." Charlotte thought about her grandfather, about the way he had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. She thought about Harold Bennett and his grasping ambition, about the home that had been her sanctuary, about the future her grandfather had worked so hard to secure for her. "I'm certain," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. Gabriel nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then I'll make the arrangements." As Charlotte rose to leave, Gabriel stood as well, coming around the desk to escort her to the door. For a moment they stood close enough that she could catch the faint scent of his cologne, something expensive and masculine that seemed to suit him perfectly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken implications, until Gabriel reached past her to open the door. "Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Your grandfather would be proud of your courage." She looked up at him then, really looked, and for just a moment she caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his controlled exterior. But before she could respond, the moment passed, and Gabriel Hartwell, the federal judge, had returned, professional and untouchable once more. Walking back through the courthouse halls, Charlotte felt as though she were moving through a dream. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Gabriel Hartwell, wife to one of the most powerful men in Charleston's legal community. It was a solution born of necessity rather than desire, a practical arrangement between two people bound together by loyalty to a man they had both loved. But as she drove home through the familiar streets of her childhood, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover there was nothing simple about Gabriel Hartwell at all. The Charleston County Courthouse felt different at 8 in the morning, when the halls were empty, except for the soft echo of footsteps and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Charlotte stood before the bathroom mirror in the building's marble-lined restroom, adjusting the collar of her cream-colored silk blouse for the third time. She had chosen the outfit carefully, professional but feminine, appropriate for what was, after all, just another legal proceeding. Her reflection stared back at her with eyes that seemed too large for her face, amber irises bright, with something that might have been fear or excitement or both. She had barely slept, spending the night alternating between pacing her grandfather's study and sitting in his leather chair, trying to imagine what he would say about the decision she was about to make. The sound of her name being called drew her from her thoughts. Charlotte smoothed her navy pencil skirt one final time and made her way to the clerk's office, where Gabriel was waiting with a patience that seemed carved from stone. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, his silver-touched hair impeccably styled despite the early hour. "Are you ready?" he asked, his steel-gray eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. Gabriel offered her his arm, a gesture that was both gallant and practical, as her knees felt decidedly unsteady. His strength was immediately apparent through the fine wool of his jacket, solid and reassuring in a way that she hadn't expected. The ceremony itself was conducted by Judge Patricia Whitman, a colleague of Gabriel's whose knowing smile suggested she understood far more about their arrangement than Charlotte was comfortable with. The words were simple, legally binding phrases that transformed two separate people into a legally recognized unit with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Gabriel's voice was steady and sure as he spoke his vows, the same tone he might use when delivering a verdict from the bench. When it came Charlotte's turn, she was surprised by how clear her own voice sounded, as if some part of her had accepted this decision with more confidence than her conscious mind possessed. "Do you have rings?" Judge Whitman asked, her pen poised over the marriage certificate. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. In all the practical considerations of their arrangement, somehow the detail of wedding rings had never been discussed. "We don't—" Gabriel reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box that looked suspiciously new. Inside nestled two platinum bands, one clearly masculine and substantial, the other more delicate, but no less elegant. Charlotte stared at them in surprise, wondering when he had found time to purchase them. "I thought it would be more convincing," Gabriel said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "For appearances." The ring slid onto her finger with startling ease, as if it had been made specifically for her hand. Gabriel's fingers were warm and slightly rough as he guided it into place, and Charlotte found herself studying the strong, capable shape of his hands. When she slipped the larger band onto his finger, she was struck by how intimate the gesture felt, despite the clinical nature of their arrangement. "By the power vested in me by the state of South Carolina, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Whitman declared with obvious satisfaction. "You may kiss the bride." The silence that followed was profound. Charlotte looked up at Gabriel, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, of the faint scent of his cologne and the way the morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair. His grey eyes were unreadable as they studied her face, and for a moment she thought he might actually lean down and press his lips to hers. Instead, Gabriel bent slightly and brushed the softest of kisses against her forehead, so brief and gentle that she might have imagined it, if not for the lingering warmth where his lips had touched her skin. "Congratulations," Judge Whitman said warmly, seemingly oblivious to the tension crackling between them. "I'll have the certificate ready for you within the hour." Outside the courthouse, Charleston was beginning to wake up. Early morning joggers made their way along the waterfront paths, and the first tour carriages of the day were already clip-clopping through the historic district, their drivers beginning the familiar recitations of local history and antebellum charm. Gabriel walked beside her in silence, his hands clasped behind his back in that military-precise posture she was beginning to recognize as his default stance. Charlotte found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the man who had just promised to honor and protect her with the intimidating federal judge she had observed from afar for so many years. "I've arranged for movers to collect your things this afternoon," Gabriel said finally, his voice carefully neutral, "unless you prefer to pack personally." The reality of what she had just done hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She was married to Gabriel Hartwell, and now she was expected to live in his house, share his space, navigate the complex dance of cohabitation with a man who remained as much a mystery to her as he had been an hour ago. "I'd like to pack my grandfather's study myself," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "His books, his papers, they're important to me." Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "Of course. Take whatever you need. There's plenty of room." They had reached his car, a sleek black sedan that seemed to suit him perfectly, all understated power and elegant lines. Gabriel opened the passenger door for her with old-fashioned courtesy, and Charlotte found herself studying his face, as he moved around to the driver's side. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours and difficult decisions, and something in the set of his mouth suggested he was familiar with disappointment. "Charlotte," Gabriel said as he started the engine, not looking at her, "I want you to understand that nothing has to change for you beyond your address. You'll continue your studies, pursue your own interests. I have no expectations beyond basic social courtesies." Charlotte turned to study his profile as he navigated through Charleston's narrow streets. There was something in his carefully controlled tone that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "And what if I want things to change?" Gabriel's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean, what if this arrangement becomes something more than either of us planned?" Charlotte asked, her courage surprising even herself. "What if we actually become friends?" For a moment, Gabriel's professional mask slipped, and Charlotte caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath. "I'm not good at friendship, Charlotte," he said quietly. "I'm better at distance." "Maybe," Charlotte replied, watching the familiar landmarks of her childhood slide past the window. "But my grandfather always said that the best lawyers are the ones willing to argue cases they're not sure they can win." Gabriel's mouth curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Your grandfather was a very wise man." "Yes," Charlotte said softly, touching the wedding ring on her finger. "He was." As they pulled into the circular drive of Gabriel's estate, her new home, Charlotte felt the weight of her decision settling around her like a cloak. The house was imposing, all Georgian elegance and understated wealth, set back from the road behind wrought iron gates and ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. It looked like the kind of place where important decisions were made, where power resided with quiet confidence. It also looked, Charlotte thought with a sudden pang, like the loneliest place on earth. Gabriel came around to open her door, offering his hand to help her from the car. His touch was warm and steady, and Charlotte found herself reluctant to let go as they walked together toward the front door of what was now, impossibly, her home. "Welcome to Heartfelt House," Gabriel said formally as he unlocked the heavy oak door. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." Charlotte stepped across the threshold into her new life, wondering if Gabriel Heartfelt had any idea what he had just gotten himself into. Because despite his careful words about distance and expectations, Charlotte had already decided that she was going to be far more than just a convenient solution to his promise. She was going to be his wife. Heartfelt House was magnificent in the way that museums were magnificent. Every surface polished to perfection, every piece of furniture positioned with mathematical precision, every room a testament to wealth and taste that had been cultivated over generations. Charlotte stood in the marble-floored foyer, her reflection multiplied in the crystal chandelier overhead, and felt as though she had stepped into a beautiful, lifeless mausoleum. Gabriel moved through the space with the easy familiarity of ownership, his footsteps echoing off the high ceilings as he led her through room after room of understated grandeur. The formal living room featured antique furniture that looked as though it had never been used for anything so pedestrian as actual living. The dining room boasted a table that could seat 20, though Charlotte suspected it rarely hosted more than one. "Mrs. Harper manages the household," Gabriel explained as they passed through a library that rivaled her grandfather's for sheer scope and organization. "She's been with the family for 30 years. She'll handle anything you need." Charlotte nodded, trying to absorb the reality of living in a place where she would need a household manager to navigate daily life. Her grandfather's house had been large but comfortable, lived in. This felt like a perfectly appointed stage set, waiting for actors who never arrived. "Your room is upstairs," Gabriel continued, his tone remaining carefully professional as they climbed the sweeping staircase. "I thought you'd prefer the east wing. It gets excellent morning light." He led her down a wide hallway lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, stopping before a set of double doors that opened to reveal a suite that was larger than her entire apartment near the university. The bedroom was decorated in soft blues and creams, with a sitting area that overlooked the formal gardens and a writing desk positioned to catch the morning sun. It was beautiful, elegant, and utterly impersonal. "There's a private bathroom through there," Gabriel said, gesturing to another set of doors, "and a walk-in closet. Mrs. Harper can arrange for anything you need." Charlotte moved to the window, looking out over gardens that were as precisely maintained as everything else in the house. Not a leaf was out of place, Not a flower bloomed where it wasn't supposed to. "It's lovely," she said, because it was, and because Gabriel seemed to be waiting for some response. "My room is at the end of the hall," Gabriel said quietly. "If you need anything." The implication was clear. They would be living separate lives under the same roof, maintaining the careful fiction of their arrangement while respecting the boundaries that made it possible. Charlotte turned from the window to find Gabriel watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Gabriel," she began, then stopped, unsure what she had meant to say. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I'm sorry," felt wrong. This feels like a prison might have been too honest. "I'll leave you to settle in," Gabriel said, stepping back toward the door. "Dinner is at 7 if you'd like to join me, though there's no obligation." After he left, Charlotte sank into the silk-upholstered chair by the window and tried to process the magnitude of what she had done. She was married to Gabriel Hartwell. She was living in his house, wearing his ring, entitled to use his name. On paper, she was one of the most enviable women in Charleston. In reality, she felt more alone than she had since her grandfather's death. The afternoon passed slowly. Mrs. Harper, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, supervised the movers as they brought Charlotte's belongings from her grandfather's house. The boxes looked pitifully small in the vast space of her new room, like children's toys scattered in an adult's office. Charlotte spent hours carefully arranging her grandfather's books on the shelves, placing his favorite paperweight on the writing desk, hanging his diploma beside the window, where he would have appreciated the view. By evening, the room looked less like a hotel suite and more like a place where someone actually lived, though she still felt like a visitor who might be asked to leave at any moment. At 7 o'clock precisely, Charlotte made her way downstairs to the dining room, where Gabriel was already seated at the head of the impossibly long table. He had changed from his morning suit into dark slacks and a white dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled back to reveal strong forearms. He looked younger somehow, more approachable, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Gabriel said as he rose to hold her chair. The gesture was automatic, ingrained courtesy, but Charlotte found herself studying the way his hands moved, sure and competent in everything they did. "Did you think I'd hide in my room?" Charlotte asked, settling into the chair to his right rather than at the opposite end of the table. If they were going to maintain this charade, she saw no reason to shout at each other across 20 feet of polished mahogany. Gabriel's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "I wasn't sure what to expect. This is uncharted territory for both of us." Mrs. Harper served dinner with quiet efficiency, perfectly prepared salmon, roasted vegetables, and a wine that Gabriel chose without consulting Charlotte, but that turned out to suit her tastes perfectly. They ate in relative silence, the clink of silverware against china unnaturally loud in the formal space. "Tell me about law school," Gabriel said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet like a lifeline. "Are you still planning to specialize in family law?" Charlotte looked up from her plate, surprised by the question. "You remember that? Your grandfather was very proud of your academic achievements. He mentioned your interests several times." Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "He said you wanted to help children who found themselves in impossible situations." "Like I was," Charlotte said quietly, then immediately regretted the admission. Gabriel's personal life was carefully guarded territory, and she had no right to expect him to navigate her emotional landscape just because they now shared a name. But Gabriel leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent on her face. "Tell me," he said simply. Something in his tone encouraged honesty. "When my mother left, I spent months believing it was my fault, that if I had been better, smarter, more lovable, she would have stayed." Charlotte set down her fork, her appetite suddenly gone. "Children blame themselves for adult failures. I want to help them understand that they're not responsible for the choices other people make." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his wine glass. "Your mother was a fool," he said finally, his voice rough with something that might have been anger. "Leaving you was the worst decision she ever made." The certainty in his voice surprised Charlotte. "You didn't know me then. I could have been a terrible child." "Impossible," Gabriel replied with conviction. "You're Edward Bennett's granddaughter. You were raised with love and principle. Anyone who walked away from that kind of blessing deserves no consideration." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected defense. "Thank you," she said softly. Gabriel's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "I'm simply stating facts." But Charlotte had caught the flash of something deeper in his grey eyes, a recognition of pain that suggested Gabriel Hartwell understood abandonment in ways that went beyond intellectual sympathy. Before she could respond, he was rising from his chair, his professional mask sliding back into place. "I have some work to finish," Gabriel said, his tone becoming formal again. "Please make yourself at home. The library is available if you'd like somewhere quiet to study." Charlotte watched him leave, noting the controlled precision of his movements, the way he held himself as though prepared for attack. She remained at the table long after Mrs. Harper had cleared the dishes, staring out the tall windows at the formal gardens bathed in moonlight, and wondering what had happened to Gabriel Hartwell to make him so afraid of his own kindness. Later that night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed in her elegant prison of a room, Charlotte heard footsteps in the hallway outside her door. They paused for a moment, so briefly she might have imagined it, before continuing toward the master suite at the end of the hall. She wondered if Gabriel was finding sleep as elusive as she was, if he was lying awake in his own bed, questioning the wisdom of their arrangement. The house seemed to breathe around her, settling into nighttime quiet with the occasional creak of old wood and the distant tick of the grandfather clock in the front hall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to navigate the careful dance they had choreographed around each other's lives. But tonight, Charlotte allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding all day. Gabriel Hartwell was not at all what she had expected. Beneath his controlled exterior, she had glimpsed something vulnerable, something that called to the part of her that had always been drawn to broken things that needed healing. The question was whether he would allow her close enough to matter, or whether he would keep her at arm's length until their arrangement became as cold and formal as everything else in his perfectly ordered life. 2 weeks into their marriage, Charlotte had established a routine that allowed her to navigate the vast emptiness of Hartwell House without losing herself entirely. She rose early, before Gabriel left for court, and took her coffee in the sun-drenched breakfast nook that overlooked the back gardens. She attended her morning classes at Charleston Law, spent afternoons studying in the library that had become her sanctuary, and joined Gabriel for dinner with the careful politeness of strangers sharing a boarding house. It was a civilized arrangement, perfectly functional and absolutely suffocating. Gabriel, for his part, maintained the same scrupulous distance he had promised, treating her with the courteous respect he might show a valued colleague. He inquired about her studies, commented on current legal cases that might interest her, and never once suggested that their relationship might evolve beyond the carefully defined parameters they had established. But Charlotte was beginning to notice things that his controlled exterior couldn't quite hide. The way his grey eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, as if he were trying to solve a particularly complex legal puzzle. The careful attention he paid to her preferences at dinner, ensuring the wine was one she enjoyed, that Mrs. Harper prepared dishes that appealed to her tastes, the fact that fresh flowers appeared in her room every few days, never ostentatious arrangements, just simple bouquets of whatever was blooming in the garden. When she mentioned the flowers to Mrs. Harper, the older woman's smile was mysteriously knowing. "Judge Hartwell has always appreciated beautiful things," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "He believes surroundings should nurture the soul." It was a Thursday morning when everything changed, though Charlotte didn't realize it at the time. She was rushing to make her 8 o'clock civil procedure class, her arms full of casebooks and her mind focused on the complex property law case she was supposed to discuss that morning. The October air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and she had thrown on a lightweight scarf without really thinking about it. Gabriel was descending the front steps as she hurried toward her car, his own day undoubtedly planned with military precision. He wore a charcoal suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, his silver-touched hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "You'll be cold," he said simply, pausing on the bottom step. Charlotte looked down at herself in confusion. She wore a wool blazer over a silk blouse perfectly appropriate for the weather. "I think I'll be fine." Gabriel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the distance between them with those measured steps that somehow managed to cover ground faster than seemed possible. Before Charlotte could react, his hands were at her throat, adjusting the lightweight scarf she had thrown on as an afterthought. His touch was impersonal, efficient, the same careful attention he might give to straightening papers on his desk. But Charlotte found herself frozen by the unexpected intimacy of the gesture, by the warmth of his fingers against the delicate skin of her neck, by the faint scent of his cologne that seemed to envelop her whenever he was near. "There," Gabriel said quietly, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary before stepping back. "That's better." Charlotte touched the scarf where his fingers had been, acutely aware that he had arranged it with more care than she ever would have bothered with. "Thank you," she managed, her voice slightly breathless, in a way that had nothing to do with her rush to leave. Gabriel's grey eyes met hers for a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should have, something unspoken passing between them, like an electric current. Then his professional mask slipped back into place, and he was stepping aside to let her pass. "Have a good day at school," he said, his tone returning to its customary careful neutrality. Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice, and hurried to her car. But as she drove through Charleston's morning traffic, she couldn't stop touching the scarf where Gabriel's hands had been, couldn't stop thinking about the way his fingers had moved with such careful precision, as if she were something precious that required gentle handling. That afternoon she found herself distracted during constitutional law, her mind replaying the moment when Gabriel had stepped into her personal space with the same quiet authority he brought to everything else. Professor Morrison was discussing the Fourth Amendment's application to digital privacy, a topic that usually fascinated Charlotte, but she found herself staring out the window and thinking about grey eyes and careful hands. When she returned to Hartwell House that evening, Mrs. Harper met her at the door with an expression of barely contained concern. "There's been an incident," she said without preamble. "Judge Hartwell was taken to Charleston General this afternoon." Charlotte's blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "A robbery attempt outside the courthouse," Mrs. Harper explained, leading Charlotte toward the living room where she had already laid out Charlotte's car keys and purse. "3 men, apparently. Judge Hartwell fought them off, but he was injured in the process. He's conscious and alert, but the doctors want to keep him overnight for observation." Charlotte was moving before Mrs. Harper finished speaking, grabbing her keys and heading for the door with an urgency that surprised her. She had expected to feel concern. Gabriel was her husband, after all, even if their marriage was merely a legal convenience. She had not expected the raw terror that clawed at her chest, the desperate need to see for herself that he was alive and whole. Charleston General's emergency department was a maze of fluorescent lights and antiseptic smells that brought back unwelcome memories of her grandfather's final days. Charlotte approached the information desk with hands that trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. "Gabriel Hartwell," she said to the tired-looking nurse behind the desk. "I'm his wife." The word felt strange on her tongue, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. But it had the desired effect. The nurse's expression softened, and she consulted her computer with the kind of attention reserved for family members. "Room 314, the nurse said gently. "Take the elevator to the 3rd floor and follow the signs for the surgical ward." Charlotte found Gabriel sitting up in the narrow hospital bed, his left arm in a sling and a butterfly bandage covering a cut on his forehead. He wore a hospital gown that did nothing to diminish his commanding presence, though she could see exhaustion in the set of his shoulders and something like vulnerability in his grey eyes. "Charlotte." His voice was rough. Whether from injury or surprise, she couldn't tell. "You didn't need to come." "Yes, I did," Charlotte said simply, settling into the visitor's chair beside his bed without waiting for an invitation. Mrs. Harper said there were 3 of them. Gabriel's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "Mrs. Harper has a tendency toward drama. It was 2 teenagers who picked the wrong target. I've been in worse scrapes." Charlotte studied his face, noting the careful way he held himself, the pallor beneath his usual commanding presence. "You could have been killed." "But I wasn't," Gabriel replied, his tone becoming gentler as he registered the distress she was trying to hide. "I'm fine, Charlotte. A dislocated shoulder and some bruised ribs, nothing that won't heal." Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. She had not expected the depth of her relief, the way her heart had started beating again the moment she saw him sitting up and arguing with hospital staff like his usual autocratic self. The realization that Gabriel Hartwell had become important to her, more important than their carefully defined arrangement should have allowed, hit her like a physical blow. "There's something else," Gabriel said quietly, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that seemed reserved for moments when his careful control slipped. "One of them had a knife. When I was fighting them off, all I could think about was getting home to you." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Charlotte reached out without thinking, her fingers closing around Gabriel's uninjured hand. His skin was warm, slightly rough from years of handling legal briefs and law books, and completely steady, despite everything he had been through. "I'm glad you did," she said softly, her thumb tracing over his knuckles in a gesture that was part comfort, part claim. "Come home, I mean." Gabriel's grey eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Charlotte, Mrs. Hartwell?" A doctor appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand and the kind of professional smile that suggested good news. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. Your husband is going to be just fine, but I'd like to keep him overnight for observation. Head injuries can be tricky." Charlotte found herself nodding as if she had every right to make medical decisions for the man whose hand she was still holding. "Of course, whatever you think is best." After the doctor left, Charlotte remained in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, her hand still covering Gabriel's. Neither of them spoke about the casual way she had accepted the role of concerned wife, the natural ease with which she had claimed her place at his bedside. "You should go home," Gabriel said finally, though he made no move to withdraw his hand from hers. "Get some rest. Mrs. Harper will worry if you're out too late." "I'm staying," Charlotte replied with a certainty that surprised them both. "You shouldn't be alone." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving in small circles against her palm, in a gesture so unconscious she wasn't sure he realized he was doing it. "I'm not used to having someone worry about me," he said finally. "Well," Charlotte said, settling more comfortably in her chair and tightening her grip on his hand, "you'd better get used to it." As the evening stretched into night, Charlotte dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, while Gabriel slept in the narrow hospital bed. When she woke near dawn, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his grey eyes soft with something that looked dangerously like tenderness. "Good morning," she said softly, suddenly self-conscious about her rumpled clothes and the way her hair had escaped its careful arrangement. "Good morning," Gabriel replied, his voice rough with sleep. "Thank you for staying." Charlotte smiled, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "Thank you for coming home." It was only later, as they drove home through Charleston's awakening streets with Gabriel settled carefully in the passenger seat, that Charlotte realized something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained was gone, replaced by something warmer and infinitely more dangerous. Gabriel Hartwell was no longer just the man she had married for practical reasons. He was becoming someone she cared about, someone whose safety mattered more than it should, someone whose rare smiles had the power to change her entire day. The question was what she was going to do about it. Gabriel's recovery from the robbery attempt was characteristically stubborn and methodical. Despite doctor's orders to rest, he insisted on working from home, transforming the morning room into a temporary office where he could review case files while keeping his injured arm properly supported. Charlotte found herself checking on him with increasing frequency, bringing him coffee that he accepted with bemused gratitude and asking about cases with genuine interest that seemed to surprise them both. It was during one of these impromptu visits, 3 days after the hospital incident, that Charlotte discovered something that changed her understanding of Gabriel Hartwell entirely. She had been looking for him to ask about dinner plans when she noticed the French doors to the back terrace standing open. Following the sound of movement, Charlotte stepped outside into the crisp October afternoon and found Gabriel kneeling in what had once been a garden bed, his injured arm still in its sling, carefully turning soil with a hand trowel. The sight stopped her cold. Gabriel Hartwell, federal judge and pillar of Charleston's legal establishment, was gardening. More than that, he was gardening in a section of the formal grounds that had clearly been neglected for years, where overgrown boxwood hedges created a private alcove hidden from the main house. "You shouldn't be doing that with your shoulder," Charlotte said, stepping closer to where Gabriel worked with careful precision despite his injury. Gabriel looked up, a streak of soil across his cheek and something almost guilty in his grey eyes. "The bulbs won't plant themselves," he said, gesturing to a collection of what appeared to be lavender starts arranged beside him on the ground. Charlotte knelt beside him, studying the small plants with growing understanding. "Lavender," she said softly. "My grandfather always said lavender was my grandmother's favorite flower." Gabriel's hands stilled in the soil. She had extensive gardens before she died. This was her private space where she came to think. His voice dropped to that intimate tone that seemed to emerge when his careful control slipped. "Your grandfather showed me pictures once. Said you had her eyes." The admission hung between them like a confession. Charlotte looked around the neglected space, seeing past the overgrown weeds to the bones of what had once been a carefully tended sanctuary. "You're restoring it," she said. Not quite a question. "I thought—" Gabriel began, then stopped, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was revealing more than he intended. "I thought you might like somewhere to study when the weather's nice, somewhere that felt less like a museum." Charlotte's throat tightened with emotion she hadn't expected. The formal gardens that surrounded Heartwell House were beautiful but intimidating, maintained by professional landscapers who kept everything in perfect, untouchable order. This hidden alcove, with its promise of lavender and Gabriel's careful attention, felt like something entirely different. It felt like a gift. "How long have you been working on it?" Charlotte asked, reaching for one of the lavender starts. Her fingers brushed Gabriel's as he handed her the small trowel, and she felt that now familiar electric current that seemed to spark whenever they touched. "Since the day after we were married," Gabriel admitted, his cheeks darkening slightly. "I may have been overly optimistic about the timeline." Charlotte couldn't help smiling at his obvious embarrassment. Gabriel Heartwell, who commanded federal courtrooms with effortless authority, was blushing because he had been caught performing an act of unexpected kindness. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "or it will be." They worked together in comfortable silence, Gabriel directing her efforts with the kind of patient instruction that suggested he knew more about gardening than his professional demeanor implied. Charlotte found herself studying his hands as he demonstrated proper planting depth, noting the careful way he handled each small plant as if it was something precious. "Where did you learn to garden?" Charlotte asked, settling a lavender start into the prepared soil with the precision Gabriel had shown her. Gabriel was quiet for so long that Charlotte thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled in a way that suggested painful territory. "My mother had a garden. Before she died, she taught me that growing things required patience and faith, that sometimes the most beautiful things came from the darkest soil." Charlotte's hands stilled in the earth. Gabriel never spoke about his family, about the childhood that had shaped him into the controlled, careful man he had become. "How old were you when she died?" 8, Gabriel replied simply, his attention focused on the plant he was settling into place. "Cancer. It was difficult." The understatement was so typically Gabriel that Charlotte felt her heart twist. She could imagine him as a boy, trying to be strong while his world fell apart, learning early that depending on others led only to disappointment. "And your father?" Gabriel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Left 6 months later. Apparently, single parenthood wasn't part of his life plan." Charlotte absorbed this information, understanding suddenly why Gabriel had built such careful walls around himself, why he approached emotional intimacy with the same caution most people reserved for explosive devices. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "It was a long time ago," Gabriel replied, but Charlotte caught the way his jaw tightened, the careful control that suggested old wounds that had never quite healed. "Foster care, military school, scholarships. I survived." "You did more than survive," Charlotte said with conviction. "You became extraordinary." Gabriel's grey eyes met hers across the small space between them, something vulnerable flickering in their depths before his professional mask slipped back into place. "I became useful," he corrected. "There's a difference." Charlotte wanted to argue, to tell him that usefulness and worth were not the same thing, that the man who planted lavender gardens for women he barely knew was someone worth caring about entirely, apart from his professional accomplishments. But before she could find the words, Gabriel was rising to his feet, brushing soil from his hands, with movements that suggested their moment of intimacy was over. "We should go in," Gabriel said, his tone returning to its customary, careful politeness. "Mrs. Harper will have dinner ready soon." But as they gathered the gardening tools, Charlotte noticed Gabriel's careful attention to her hands, the way he steadied her elbow when she stumbled slightly on the uneven ground. And when they reached the French doors, he paused to hold them open for her, his free hand briefly touching the small of her back in a gesture so unconscious and natural that Charlotte felt her breath catch. That night at dinner, Charlotte found herself studying Gabriel's face in the candlelight, seeing past his controlled exterior to the man who remembered that her grandmother had loved lavender, who had spent weeks preparing a surprise that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement and everything to do with kindness. "The garden will be beautiful," Charlotte said as Mrs. Harper served dessert, a perfectly crafted tart that Gabriel had obviously requested specifically for her tastes. Gabriel's expression softened slightly. "It will take time. Gardens require patience." "Good things usually do," Charlotte replied, her voice carrying implications she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. Gabriel's grey eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment Charlotte thought she saw something there that went beyond careful politeness, beyond their carefully defined arrangement. Something that looked dangerously like hope. Later that night, as Charlotte lay in her elegant bedroom thinking about Gabriel's hands in the soil and the way his voice had dropped when he spoke about his mother, she realized that their marriage of convenience was becoming something far more complicated. She was beginning to care about Gabriel Hartwell in ways that had nothing to do with legal protection and everything to do with the growing certainty that beneath his controlled exterior lived a man worth loving. The question was whether he would ever allow her close enough to try. Outside her window, the formal gardens lay in moonlit perfection, every hedge and flower bed maintained in flawless order. But somewhere beyond the manicured lawns, in a hidden alcove where lavender would soon bloom, Gabriel Hartwell had planted something that looked remarkably like faith, and Charlotte was beginning to think that might be the most dangerous thing of all. Charlotte woke on the following Tuesday with a headache that felt like someone was driving nails into her skull, and a throat so raw that swallowing was an exercise in determination. The November morning was grey and damp, matching her suddenly fragile state perfectly. She had been pushing herself too hard, late nights studying for midterm exams, early mornings working in the garden with Gabriel, the emotional energy required to navigate their increasingly complex relationship. Her body had finally decided to stage a revolt. By the time she managed to drag herself to the bathroom, Charlotte knew she was in no condition for classes. Her reflection in the mirror confirmed what she already suspected: flushed cheeks, glassy eyes, and the kind of exhaustion that suggested her immune system had waved a white flag. She sent a text to her study group, cancelled her afternoon appointments, and crawled back into bed with the intention of sleeping until she felt human again. That was Gabriel's first clue that something was wrong. Charlotte's absence from the breakfast table, where she had taken to joining him each morning, sharing coffee and comfortable conversation that had become the highlight of his carefully ordered days. When Mrs. Harper mentioned that Charlotte hadn't come down for her usual morning routine, Gabriel felt something twist in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing ribs. He found her curled beneath the silk comforter in her elegant bedroom, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, and her usually composed features flushed with fever. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable, nothing like the strong, determined woman who challenged him at dinner each night with her quick wit and unexpected insights. "Charlotte?" Gabriel's voice was soft, carefully modulated to avoid startling her. "Mrs. Harper said you weren't feeling well." Charlotte opened eyes that were bright with fever and slightly unfocused. "Just tired," she mumbled, though the hoarseness in her voice suggested something more serious than simple exhaustion. "I'll be fine in a few hours." Gabriel approached the bed with the same careful attention he brought to complex legal cases, his judicial training automatically cataloguing symptoms and reaching conclusions. Fever, obviously. Fatigue that suggested her body was fighting something significant. The careful way she held herself that indicated everything hurt. "You're ill," Gabriel said simply, settling into the chair beside her bed without asking permission. "Have you taken anything for the fever?" Charlotte shook her head slightly, immediately regretting the movement. "There's aspirin in the bathroom cabinet. I just need to sleep it off." Gabriel disappeared and returned with water, aspirin, and a thermometer that he somehow produced from the depths of his practical mind. "Under your tongue," he instructed with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, even from federal court defendants. The thermometer beeped its disapproval, 102.3 degrees. Gabriel's expression tightened in a way that suggested he was taking her condition more seriously than she was. "I'm calling Dr. Morrison," he said, already reaching for his phone. "You don't need to," Charlotte began, but Gabriel silenced her with a look that had probably terrorized countless attorneys. "I'm calling Dr. Morrison," Gabriel repeated with the kind of finality that ended courtroom arguments. "And you're going to rest while I handle everything else." Charlotte was too exhausted to argue further. She dozed fitfully while Gabriel made phone calls with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did, his voice carrying from the hallway in low, authoritative tones that somehow managed to be both commanding and comforting. When she woke again, the afternoon light was slanting through her windows at an angle that suggested she had lost several hours. Gabriel was still in the chair beside her bed, though he had shed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, his injured arm finally free of its sling. He was reading case files, but his attention shifted to her immediately when she stirred. "Better?" Gabriel asked, reaching out to touch her forehead with the back of his hand. His skin was cool against her fevered brow, and Charlotte found herself leaning into the contact before she could stop herself. "A little," Charlotte admitted, though speaking still felt like swallowing gravel. "You don't have to stay. I'm sure you have important judge things to do." Gabriel's mouth curved in what might have been amusement. "Important judge things," he repeated, his tone suggesting he found her fever-induced candor unexpectedly charming. "I've rescheduled everything that couldn't be handled by phone. Dr. Morrison confirmed it's just a particularly aggressive flu virus, but she wants you to rest completely for at least 3 days. Charlotte tried to process this information through the fog of illness and medication. "You cancelled your schedule for me?" "You're my wife," Gabriel said simply, as if that explained everything. "Of course I cancelled my schedule." The matter-of-fact way he said it, as if caring for her was the most natural thing in the world, made Charlotte's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't quite name. Their marriage might have begun as a practical arrangement, but Gabriel was treating her illness with the kind of devoted attention usually reserved for genuinely beloved spouses. "Gabriel," Charlotte began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the complex feelings his presence stirred. "This isn't what we agreed to." Gabriel set aside his case files, giving her his complete attention in that focused way that made her feel like the most important person in his carefully ordered world. "Perhaps not," he said quietly, "but I find I care less about our original agreement than I do about making sure you're comfortable." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Charlotte studied Gabriel's face, noting the lines of concern around his grey eyes, the way he had positioned himself to be within easy reach if she needed anything. He looked nothing like the intimidating federal judge who commanded courtrooms with effortless authority. He looked like a man genuinely worried about someone he cared for. "Stay with me?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just until I fall asleep again." Gabriel's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. "Of course." Charlotte drifted in and out of feverish sleep throughout the afternoon and evening, aware in some distant way of Gabriel's consistent presence beside her bed. When her fever spiked again near midnight, she woke to find him gently wiping her face with a cool cloth, his touch infinitely careful and somehow reverent. "Shh," Gabriel murmured when she tried to speak, his voice rough with something that might have been exhaustion or emotion. "Just rest. I'm here." The next morning, Charlotte woke feeling significantly more human to find Gabriel asleep in the chair beside her bed, his usually perfect appearance rumpled from a night spent in uncomfortable vigil. His dark hair was mussed, his dress shirt wrinkled, and there was stubble along his jaw that suggested he hadn't bothered with his usual morning routine. He looked younger in sleep, more vulnerable, the harsh lines of his face softened by rest and the morning light streaming through her windows. Charlotte found herself studying the sweep of his dark lashes against his cheekbones, the way his mouth relaxed when he wasn't consciously maintaining his judicial composure. "Good morning," Gabriel said without opening his eyes, his voice rough with sleep but tinged with something that might have been relief. "You stayed all night," Charlotte observed, her voice still hoarse but significantly stronger than it had been the day before. Gabriel opened his grey eyes, immediately alert in the way that suggested years of training in crisis management. "Your fever broke around 4?" he said, rising from the chair with movements that betrayed the stiffness of spending a night in an uncomfortable position. "How do you feel?" "Better," Charlotte said truthfully, though she was acutely aware of how disheveled she must look after 2 days of illness. "Thank you for everything." Gabriel moved to the window, adjusting the curtains to let in more of the morning light. "There's nothing to thank me for," he said, his tone becoming more formal as his professional mask began to reassert itself. "I simply did what needed to be done." But Charlotte had seen the way he touched her forehead to check for fever, had felt the careful attention he paid to her comfort, even when he thought she was sleeping. Gabriel Heartwell might insist their relationship was merely practical, but his actions suggested something far more personal. "Gabriel," Charlotte said as he prepared to leave her to rest, "what you did, staying with me, taking care of me, that's not something you do for a convenient arrangement." Gabriel paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders tense beneath his wrinkled shirt. When he turned back to face her, Charlotte caught a glimpse of something raw and unguarded in his grey eyes. "No," Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of admission he hadn't intended. "It isn't." After he left, Charlotte lay in her bed thinking about the implications of those simple words. Gabriel Heartwell, who had built his life around careful control and emotional distance, had spent 2 days caring for her with the kind of devoted attention that spoke of feelings far deeper than their original agreement had contemplated. The question was what they were going to do about the growing certainty that their marriage of convenience was becoming something neither of them had planned for, and something infinitely more dangerous than either was prepared to handle. Outside her window, the November morning was crisp and clear, and Charlotte could see the hidden alcove where Gabriel had planted lavender that would bloom in the spring. Like their relationship, it was something that required patience and faith, something that grew stronger in the dark and promised beauty in its own time. Charlotte was beginning to think she was ready to find out what that beauty might look like. The Charleston Bar Association's annual Winter Gala was the kind of event that Gabriel usually endured rather than enjoyed. 3 hours of carefully orchestrated networking disguised as social celebration, where every conversation carried professional implications and every smile was calculated for maximum advantage. This year, however, Gabriel found himself looking forward to the evening for reasons that had nothing to do with legal politics and everything to do with the woman who would be accompanying him as his wife. Charlotte had recovered completely from her illness, though Gabriel found himself watching her with protective attention that went far beyond their original arrangement. She seemed unaware of his scrutiny, throwing herself back into her studies with characteristic determination, while navigating their increasingly complex relationship with a grace that both impressed and unsettled him. The dress she chose for the gala was a testament to her instinctive understanding of Charleston's social hierarchy. Deep emerald silk that brought out the gold flecks in her amber eyes, elegantly cut but appropriately conservative for a federal judge's wife. When she appeared at the top of the staircase that evening, Gabriel felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a recognition that went beyond mere appreciation for her beauty. Charlotte Bennett Heartwell was magnificent, and the possessive pride that surged through him at the sight of her had nothing to do with their practical arrangement, and everything to do with feelings he was no longer able to deny. "But you look beautiful," Gabriel said as he helped her into her coat, his fingers lingering longer than necessary at her shoulders. "Perfect, actually." Charlotte's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand coming to rest briefly over his where it lay against her shoulder. "You clean up rather well yourself." The gala was held at the historic Mills House, its antebellum grandeur providing the perfect backdrop for Charleston's legal elite to display their wealth and influence. Gabriel moved through the crowd with practiced ease, Charlotte's hand tucked securely in the crook of his arm, introducing her to colleagues and judges, with a pride that surprised even him. Charlotte handled the social requirements with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else, engaging in conversations about legal reform and community service with an intelligence that commanded respect from men who had initially dismissed her as merely decorative. Gabriel found himself studying her animated face as she discussed family law advocacy with Judge Patterson's wife, noting the way her eyes lit up when she spoke about subjects that mattered to her. "Your bride is quite impressive," Judge Morrison observed, appearing at Gabriel's elbow with the kind of knowing smile that suggested years of watching colleagues navigate the treacherous waters of legal marriages. Edward would be proud. Gabriel's attention was drawn back to Charlotte, who was now engaged in what appeared to be a spirited discussion about children's rights with several prominent attorneys. "Yes," Gabriel said quietly, something possessive and protective stirring in his chest. "She is." The evening progressed smoothly until Marcus Webb appeared, a young assistant district attorney with political ambitions and the kind of predatory charm that Gabriel had learned to distrust on sight. Webb was handsome in an obvious way, with sandy hair and blue eyes that seemed to catalogue every woman in the room for potential advantage. Gabriel watched with growing tension as Webb approached Charlotte during a moment when Gabriel was detained by a conversation with the Chief Justice about upcoming court appointments. Webb's interest was immediately obvious, the way he positioned himself slightly too close, the practiced smile that had undoubtedly charmed countless women, the subtle touches that pushed the boundaries of appropriate social interaction. Charlotte, for her part, seemed oblivious to Webb's intentions, engaging with him with the same polite attention she had shown everyone else that evening. But Gabriel recognized the signs of a man on the hunt, and every protective instinct he possessed was suddenly screaming warnings. "May I have this dance?" Webb asked Charlotte as the orchestra began a waltz, his hand already extended in expectation of acceptance. Charlotte glanced toward Gabriel, who was still trapped in conversation but watching their interaction with increasing focus. When she looked back at Webb, her smile was polite but not encouraging. "Of course," she said, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor. Gabriel attempted to focus on the Chief Justice's discussion of judicial appointments, but his attention was completely captured by the sight of Marcus Webb's hands on his wife. The man was an adequate dancer, Gabriel was forced to admit, but he held Charlotte closer than propriety required and seemed far too interested in whatever conversation they were having. "Excuse me," Gabriel said abruptly, interrupting the Chief Justice mid-sentence. "I need to attend to something." Gabriel moved across the crowded ballroom with the kind of focused intensity that had made him legendary in federal court, his grey eyes fixed on the couple still moving together on the dance floor. He reached them just as the waltz was ending, his timing precise and his intention unmistakable. "I believe this dance is mine," Gabriel said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that brooked no argument. His hand closed over Charlotte's waist with possessive certainty as Webb was forced to step aside. Webb's expression suggested he recognized both the dismissal and the warning inherent in Gabriel's intervention. "Of course, Judge Hartwell," he said with forced courtesy. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Hartwell. Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time." Gabriel drew Charlotte closer as the orchestra began another piece, his hand settling at the small of her back with proprietary confidence. She felt perfect in his arms, the right height, the right fit, as if they had been designed to move together in precisely this way. "Jealous?" Charlotte asked softly, her amber eyes sparkling with something that might have been amusement. Gabriel's jaw tightened at her perceptive observation. "Webb has a reputation," he said carefully, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I was simply protecting your interests." "My interests," Charlotte repeated, her tone suggesting she found his explanation less than convincing. "Not your own?" Gabriel spun her expertly through a complex turn, using the movement to avoid answering directly. But Charlotte's question had hit its mark, forcing him to acknowledge truths he had been avoiding for weeks. His reaction to seeing another man's hands on Charlotte had nothing to do with protecting her reputation and everything to do with the growing certainty that he was beginning to think of her as his in ways that went far beyond their legal arrangement. "You matter to me," Gabriel said finally, his voice rough with admission. "More than you should, given our agreement." Charlotte's breath caught at his words, her fingers tightening against his shoulder. "Gabriel, I know what we agreed to," Gabriel continued, his grey eyes intense on her face. "I know this was supposed to be purely practical, but I find myself caring about you in ways I never intended." The music swirled around them as they moved together across the polished floor, other couples becoming a blur of color and movement, as Gabriel's focus narrowed to the woman in his arms. Charlotte's face was tilted up toward his, her lips slightly parted in surprise at his unexpected honesty. "What does that mean?" Charlotte asked softly, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his hands tightening almost imperceptibly as he held her close enough to feel the warmth of her body through the silk of her dress. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I only know that seeing Webb touch you made me want to remind everyone in this room that you're mine." The possessive certainty in his voice sent heat spiraling through Charlotte's chest. "Am I?" she asked, her amber eyes searching his face. "Yours, I mean?" Gabriel's control, so carefully maintained for months of their arrangement, finally began to crack. "Charlotte," he said, her name carrying a weight of longing he could no longer hide. "You have no idea what you do to me." Before Charlotte could respond, the music ended and they were forced to separate as other couples moved around them. But the intensity of their conversation lingered between them like an electric current, charging the air with possibilities neither had been willing to acknowledge before. Gabriel escorted Charlotte from the dance floor with his hand possessively at her back, his grey eyes scanning the room with the kind of territorial awareness that suggested he was marking his territory for anyone bold enough to challenge his claim. "We should go," Gabriel said quietly, his voice rough with emotions he was still struggling to control. "I think we've fulfilled our social obligations for the evening." Charlotte nodded, suddenly eager to escape the crowded ballroom and the curious eyes of Charleston's legal community. She could feel the change in Gabriel, the way his careful composure had shifted into something more intense and infinitely more dangerous. As they collected their coats and made their polite goodbyes, Charlotte found herself stealing glances at Gabriel's profile, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his hands moved with barely controlled energy. Whatever had passed between them on the dance floor had changed something fundamental, crossing boundaries that neither of them could uncross. The drive home was conducted in charged silence, both of them acutely aware of the shift in their relationship, both uncertain how to navigate the new territory they found themselves in. But as Gabriel helped Charlotte from the car and they walked together toward the front door of Hartwell House, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that they were approaching a point of no return. Gabriel Hartwell had claimed her as his on that dance floor, and Charlotte was beginning to realize that she wanted nothing more than to make that claim a reality in every way that mattered. The tension that had crackled between them during the drive home followed Gabriel and Charlotte into Hartwell House like an uninvited guest. Gabriel moved with restless energy as they entered the foyer, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides, as if he were fighting some internal battle that Charlotte couldn't see but could feel in every charged moment of silence between them. "Would you like some tea?" Charlotte asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the way her pulse was racing. Mrs. Harper left everything prepared. Gabriel turned to face her, his grey eyes dark with something that made Charlotte's breath catch. "I don't want tea, Charlotte," he said quietly, his voice rough with honest admission. "I want to finish the conversation we started on that dance floor." Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs as she studied Gabriel's face, noting the way his usual careful control seemed to be fraying at the edges. "What conversation was that?" "The one where I admitted that our arrangement stopped being purely practical weeks ago," Gabriel said, taking a step closer. "The one where I told you that you matter to me in ways I never intended." Charlotte felt her back come up against the marble console table in the foyer, though she couldn't remember stepping backward. Gabriel stood close enough that she could see the flecks of darker grey in his eyes, could catch the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something that was uniquely him. "Gabriel," Charlotte began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "Let me finish," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that seemed to bypass her rational mind entirely. "I've spent months telling myself that what I feel for you is gratitude or responsibility, or some misguided sense of honor toward your grandfather. But tonight, watching Webb touch you, I realized I was lying to myself." Charlotte's hands gripped the edge of the console table behind her, needing something solid to anchor herself as Gabriel's words washed over her. "Yeah, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm falling in love with my own wife," Gabriel said with the kind of brutal honesty that seemed to surprise even him, "and I have no idea what to do about it." The admission hung between them, like a bridge that neither could uncross. Charlotte stared up at Gabriel's face, searching for any sign that he might take back words that had the power to change everything between them. "Are you?" Charlotte asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Falling in love with me?" Gabriel's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverent care. "I'm terrified of what you make me feel," he said quietly. "I've spent my entire adult life building walls, maintaining control. But you walk through every defense I've ever constructed like they're made of paper." Charlotte leaned into his touch, her eyes falling closed as she absorbed the warmth of his hands against her skin. "Maybe your walls were never meant to keep everyone out," she said softly. "Maybe they were just meant to keep you safe until the right person came along." Gabriel's thumb traced over her lower lip with careful precision, and Charlotte felt her breath hitch at the intimate contact. "And you think you're that person?" Charlotte opened her eyes, meeting Gabriel's intense gaze with courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I think I could be, if you let me." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. "Charlotte," he said finally, her name carrying a weight of longing that made her pulse quicken. "If we cross this line, there's no going back. Our arrangement, our careful distance, it all changes." "I know," Charlotte said, her hands coming up to cover his where they still framed her face. "I want it to change." Gabriel's control finally snapped. He leaned down and pressed his forehead against hers, his breath coming in careful measures, as if he were trying to maintain some last vestige of restraint. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he said roughly. "Then show me," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. Gabriel pulled back to look at her, his eyes dark with desire and something deeper that might have been love. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not like this." Without another word, Gabriel took her hand and led her through the house toward the French doors that opened onto the back terrace. The November night was crisp and clear, with a full moon casting silver light across the formal gardens and the hidden alcove where Gabriel had planted lavender that would bloom in the spring. He stopped in the shelter of the terrace, surrounded by climbing roses that had lost their blooms but retained their romantic architecture. Here, away from the formal constraints of the house, Gabriel seemed to relax into something more essentially himself. "I've never done this before," Gabriel said quietly, his hand still holding hers with careful reverence. Charlotte tilted her head, confused. "Done what?" "Fallen in love with someone I respect," Gabriel replied, his voice rough with honesty. "Someone whose opinion matters more than my own comfort." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the vulnerability in his admission. "Gabriel," she said softly, reaching up to touch his face, "I love you too." Gabriel's eyes fell closed at her words, as if they were a benediction he had never expected to receive. When he opened them again, Charlotte saw something that looked like wonder mixed with the desire that had been building between them for months. "Are you certain?" Gabriel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because once I kiss you, Charlotte, once I stop pretending that this is just an arrangement, I won't be able to let you go." Charlotte smiled, her heart full of love for this complicated, careful man who had somehow become the center of her world. "I'm counting on it," she said. Gabriel's mouth came down on hers with careful reverence, as if she were something precious that required gentle handling. The kiss was soft, exploratory, a question more than a demand. But when Charlotte responded, her lips parting under his with eager welcome, Gabriel's restraint began to slip. His arms came around her, pulling her closer as the kiss deepened into something that spoke of months of carefully controlled desire finally given free rein. Charlotte could taste moonlight and possibility on Gabriel's lips, could feel the barely leashed power in his arms as he held her against him. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers once more. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying a weight of certainty that made Charlotte's heart soar. "I love you too," Charlotte replied, her hands fisted in the front of his dress shirt. "What happens now?" Gabriel's smile was soft and genuine, transforming his usually serious face into something that took Charlotte's breath away. "Now," he said quietly, "we figure out how to be married for real." Charlotte woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and the profound sense that everything in her world had shifted during the night. The memory of Gabriel's kiss, of his hands holding her face with such careful reverence, of the way he had said "I love you" like a man offering his entire soul, it all felt too perfect to be real. But the platinum wedding band on her finger caught the morning light differently now. No longer a symbol of practical arrangement, but something that carried the weight of genuine commitment. Gabriel loved her. She loved him. And somehow, Their marriage of convenience had become something neither of them had dared to hope for. The soft knock on her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Charlotte?" Gabriel's voice was careful, uncertain in a way that was entirely unlike his usual commanding presence. "May I come in?" Charlotte sat up in bed, suddenly conscious of her silk nightgown and tousled hair. "Of course." Gabriel entered carrying a breakfast tray that looked suspiciously like Mrs. Harper's work, though something about his careful movements suggested he had insisted on bringing it himself. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled back, looking younger and more approachable than she had ever seen him. "I thought you might be hungry," Gabriel said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "Mrs. Harper prepared your favorites." Charlotte rose from the bed, acutely aware of Gabriel's eyes following her movements as she approached the table. The morning felt charged with new possibilities, but also weighted with uncertainty about how to navigate this fundamental change in their relationship. "Thank you," Charlotte said softly, settling into one of the chairs. "This is lovely." Gabriel took the chair across from her, his grey eyes studying her face with the same careful attention he had shown since the night they were married. But now there was something different in his expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before, a sense of rightness that transformed his usually serious features. "About last night," Gabriel began, his voice careful but not hesitant. "I want you to know that nothing has to change if you're not ready. Our arrangement can remain—" "Gabriel," Charlotte interrupted gently, reaching across the small table to cover his hand with hers. "Do you regret what happened?" Gabriel's fingers turned under hers, capturing her hand with careful strength. "No," he said immediately, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I regret that it took me so long to be honest about my feelings, but I don't regret telling you I love you, and I certainly don't regret kissing you." Charlotte felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "Then why are you offering me an escape route?" Gabriel was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm in a gesture that was becoming familiar and precious. "Because I know this wasn't what you signed up for," he said finally. "When you agreed to marry me, it was for protection, for security, not for a complicated relationship with a man who doesn't know how to love properly." Charlotte studied Gabriel's face, noting the vulnerability beneath his careful control. "What makes you think you don't know how to love properly?" Gabriel's expression darkened slightly. "I've never had much practice. My mother died when I was young, my father disappeared, and since then—" He shrugged, the gesture suggesting old wounds that hadn't quite healed. "I've spent my life avoiding emotional entanglements that might require skills I don't possess." Charlotte rose from her chair and moved around the small table, settling onto the arm of Gabriel's chair with a boldness that surprised them both. His free arm came around her waist automatically, steadying her with unconscious protectiveness. "Gabriel," Charlotte said softly, her hand coming up to touch his face. "You've been showing me how to love properly since the day we were married. The way you've cared for me, protected me, created spaces where I could be comfortable, that's love in action." Gabriel leaned into her touch, his eyes falling closed as if her words were a benediction he hadn't expected to receive. "You make it sound so simple." "Maybe it is," Charlotte replied, her thumb tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Maybe love isn't about having perfect skills or knowing exactly what to do. Maybe it's just about showing up, being present, caring enough to try." Gabriel opened his eyes, and Charlotte saw something that looked like hope, mixed with the desire that had been building between them for months. "And you want me to try? With you?" "I want us to try together," Charlotte corrected, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. "I want to figure out how to be married for real, how to build something lasting together." Gabriel's arm tightened around her waist, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might kiss her again, might continue what they had started under the moonlight the night before. But instead, he simply held her close, his face buried against her shoulder, as if he were absorbing the reality of what she was offering. "I love you," Gabriel said quietly, his voice muffled against her silk nightgown. "I know I said it last night, but I need you to hear it again. I love you, Charlotte. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. "I love you too," she said, her fingers threading through his dark hair. "And I want to spend the rest of our marriage showing you exactly how much." Gabriel pulled back to look at her, his grey eyes bright with something that might have been joy. "The rest of our marriage," he repeated, as if testing the words. "I like the sound of that." Charlotte smiled, her heart full of love for this complicated, careful man who had somehow become everything she hadn't known she needed. "Good," she said, leaning down to press a soft kiss to his forehead. "Because you're stuck with me now." Gabriel's smile in return was radiant, transforming his usually serious face into something that took Charlotte's breath away. "I can think of worse fates," he said quietly. As they sat together in the morning sunlight, Charlotte couldn't help but think about how much their relationship had changed since that first day when Gabriel had proposed their practical arrangement. They had begun as strangers, bound together by duty and necessity, but somehow they had discovered something precious in the careful space between them. Now they had something real to build on, love that had grown slowly and carefully, trust that had been earned through countless small gestures, and the promise of a future that neither of them had expected, but both were eager to embrace. Outside the window, Charlotte could see the hidden alcove where Gabriel had planted lavender that would bloom in the spring. Like their love, it was something that required patience and faith, something that grew stronger in the dark and promised beauty in its own time. Charlotte was beginning to think that the most beautiful things in life were worth waiting for, worth nurturing, worth fighting to protect. And Gabriel Hartwell, with his careful hands and guarded heart, was definitely worth all of that and more. 3 days after their moonlit confession, Charlotte and Gabriel existed in a state of careful exploration, learning how to navigate their transformed relationship with the same methodical precision Gabriel brought to complex legal cases. Their conversations had grown deeper, more intimate, filled with the kind of honest vulnerability that came with acknowledged love. But they moved around each other with conscious restraint, both acutely aware that physical intimacy remained an uncharted territory that would require careful navigation. Gabriel had become more tactile in small ways, his hand lingering at the small of Charlotte's back when he helped her with her coat, fingers brushing as he passed her coffee each morning, stolen moments of contact that spoke of growing intimacy without crossing the invisible boundaries they were still negotiating. Charlotte found herself studying Gabriel with new eyes, noting the way his grey gaze softened when it rested on her, the unconscious smile that curved his mouth when she laughed at something he said. He was courting her, she realized, treating her with the careful attention of a man genuinely in love, rather than a husband fulfilling obligations. It was Thursday evening when everything changed. Charlotte had been studying in the library, surrounded by case books and legal briefs for her upcoming constitutional law exam, when Gabriel appeared in the doorway wearing dark slacks and a white dress shirt that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. "You've been working for hours," Gabriel observed, moving into the room with that measured grace that had become so familiar. "Mrs. Harper has dinner ready." Charlotte looked up from her notes, noting the lines of exhaustion around Gabriel's eyes that suggested his own day had been particularly demanding. "Rough day in court?" Gabriel settled into the leather chair across from her desk, his expression softening, as it always did when his attention focused on her. "A custody case," he said quietly. "Parents more interested in hurting each other than protecting their children." Charlotte understood immediately. Gabriel rarely discussed specific cases, but she had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when his work had taken an emotional toll. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Those are the hardest ones." Gabriel's smile was tired but genuine. "Your grandfather used to say that justice without compassion was merely revenge dressed in legal robes." "He was right," Charlotte replied, closing her textbook and giving Gabriel her complete attention. "And you have more compassion than you think you do." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes studying her face with the intensity that had become so familiar. "You see things in me that I'm not sure actually exist," he said finally. Charlotte rose from her chair and moved around the desk, settling onto the arm of Gabriel's chair with the natural ease that had developed between them over the past few days. His arm came around her waist automatically, steadying her with unconscious protectiveness. "I see who you really are," Charlotte said softly, her hand coming up to touch his face. "Beneath all that judicial composure and careful control, I see a man who plants gardens for women he barely knows, who stays up all night when someone he cares about is sick, who worries about children caught in their parents' battles." Gabriel leaned into her touch, his eyes falling closed as if her words were a balm for wounds he rarely acknowledged. "Charlotte," he said quietly, her name carrying a weight of longing that made her pulse quicken. "Yes," Charlotte replied, her thumb tracing the strong line of his jaw. Gabriel opened his eyes and Charlotte saw something that looked like decision, mixed with the desire that had been building between them for days. "I don't want to sleep alone tonight," he said simply, his voice rough with honesty. "I want to hold you, wake up with you in my arms, if you're ready." Charlotte's breath caught at his words, at the careful way he offered intimacy without demanding it. "Are you asking me to share your bed?" "I'm asking you to share our bed," Gabriel corrected, his arm tightening around her waist. "If you want to. We can take this as slowly as you need." Charlotte studied Gabriel's face, noting the vulnerability beneath his careful control, the way he held himself as if prepared for rejection, even as he offered his heart. "Gabriel," she said softly, "I want to be your wife, in every way that matters." Gabriel's breath hitched at her words, and for a moment Charlotte thought he might kiss her right there in the library. Instead, he rose from the chair, lifting her easily in his arms, with a strength that made her feel delicate and precious. "Then let me love you properly," Gabriel said quietly, carrying her toward the door. "The way you deserve to be loved." Later that evening, after a dinner they barely tasted and conversations that carried undercurrents of anticipation, Gabriel led Charlotte up the stairs toward the master suite she had never entered. His hand was warm and steady in hers, his pace unhurried despite the tension that seemed to radiate from his powerful frame. The master bedroom was elegant and masculine, decorated in deep blues and rich woods that reflected Gabriel's sophisticated tastes. But Charlotte's attention was captured by the way Gabriel moved around the space, lighting candles with careful precision, creating an atmosphere of romance that spoke of genuine consideration for her comfort. "Charlotte," Gabriel said finally, turning to face her with an expression that was equal parts desire and reverence. "Are you certain?" Charlotte moved toward him, her heart full of love for this careful, controlled man who had become her entire world. "I've never been more certain of anything," she said softly, reaching up to begin unbuttoning his shirt. Gabriel's hands covered hers, stilling her movements. "I need you to know," he said quietly. "You're the first woman I've ever loved. This means everything to me." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes at his honesty. "You're my first everything," she replied. "My first love, my first husband, my first—" "I know," Gabriel said softly, his hands coming up to frame her face. "And I promise to be gentle, to take care of you." When Gabriel finally kissed her, it was with the careful reverence of a man handling something infinitely precious. And when he discovered, hours later, the proof of her innocence, he held her with such tender awe that Charlotte understood she had given her heart to a man who would treasure it always. Charlotte woke the next morning to find Gabriel's side of the bed empty, the sheets cool to the touch, as if he had been gone for hours. She lay in the pale December sunlight streaming through the master bedroom windows, replaying the previous night in her mind, the gentle way Gabriel had loved her, the reverent attention he had paid to every touch, every kiss, the way he had held her afterward, as if she was something precious beyond measure. But now he was gone, and the silence of the large house felt different somehow, charged with intention that made Charlotte's chest tighten with unease. She found Gabriel in his study, already dressed in his judicial robes despite the early hour, standing at the window with his back to the door. His posture was rigid, controlled in a way that reminded Charlotte of the distant man he had been during their first weeks of marriage. "Good morning," Charlotte said softly, suddenly conscious of her silk robe and the fact that her hair was still tousled from sleep. Gabriel turned at the sound of her voice, and Charlotte felt her heart sink at his expression. The warmth, the tenderness that had transformed his features the night before, it was gone, replaced by the careful mask of professional composure she had learned to recognize as his default armor. "Charlotte," Gabriel said, his voice carefully neutral, "I have an early court session. I didn't want to wake you." Something cold settled in Charlotte's stomach. This wasn't the man who had whispered her name like a prayer as he made love to her, who had held her close and told her she was everything he had never known he needed. This was Judge Gabriel Hartwell, distant and controlled and emotionally unavailable. "Gabriel," Charlotte began, moving closer to where he stood by the window. "About last night. Last night was a mistake," Gabriel said abruptly, his grey eyes refusing to meet hers. "I took advantage of your inexperience, your gratitude for what I've provided. It won't happen again." Charlotte felt as if he had struck her. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You think loving me was a mistake?" Gabriel's jaw tightened, but his expression remained carefully controlled. I think I confused gratitude with genuine feeling. Our arrangement was working perfectly well without complications. Complications, Charlotte echoed, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold together the pieces of her heart that Gabriel was systematically destroying. Is that what I am to you? A complication? Gabriel finally looked at her then, and Charlotte caught a glimpse of something that might have been pain before his professional mask slipped back into place. You're young, Charlotte. You'll understand eventually that what happened between us was simply proximity and convenience, not love. Charlotte stared at him, searching his face for any sign of the man who had touched her with such reverence, who had whispered that she was beautiful, that she was his. You don't mean that, she said finally. I know you don't mean that. I mean every word, Gabriel replied, his tone becoming colder. Our marriage serves its legal purpose. There's no need to complicate it with misguided romantic notions. The dismissal in his voice was like a physical blow. Charlotte felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of this stranger who had replaced the man she loved. Fine, she said quietly, lifting her chin with the same pride her grandfather would have recognized. If that's how you feel, then I'll remove myself as a complication. Gabriel's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. What do you mean? I mean I'm leaving, Charlotte said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. I'll stay with Sarah until I can make other arrangements. Our marriage can remain legally intact for whatever protection it provides, but I won't share a house with a man who considers loving me a mistake. For a moment Gabriel's careful control slipped, and Charlotte saw something raw and desperate in his grey eyes. But before she could process what she had seen, the mask was back in place more firmly than ever. That's probably for the best, Gabriel said finally, his voice carefully neutral. I'll have Mrs. Harper prepare your things. Charlotte nodded once, sharp and decisive, then turned to leave before Gabriel could see the tears that had finally begun to fall. She made it to the door before his voice stopped her. Charlotte, Gabriel said quietly, and for a moment she thought she heard something broken in his tone, but when she turned back, his expression was as controlled as ever. I'm sorry. For everything. Charlotte studied his face one final time, memorizing the strong lines and silver-touched hair, the grey eyes that had looked at her with such love just hours before. So am I, she said softly. I'm sorry I believed you when you said you loved me. 2 hours later, Charlotte was packing her belongings with mechanical precision, while Mrs. Harper hovered nearby with obvious distress. The older woman had said nothing about the sudden change in circumstances, but her disapproval was evident in every sharp movement as she folded Charlotte's clothes. He's scared, Mrs. Harper said finally, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Judge Hartwell, I mean. He's terrified of what you make him feel. Charlotte paused in her packing, a silk blouse forgotten in her hands. Fear isn't an excuse for cruelty, she said quietly. No, Mrs. Harper agreed, but it's an explanation. That man has spent his entire adult life believing that love leads to abandonment. His mother died, his father left, and every woman since has been interested in his position rather than his heart. Charlotte felt fresh tears threaten at the older woman's words. And yet he made me believe I was different. You are different, Mrs. Harper said with conviction. That's what terrifies him. You're the first person who could actually matter enough to destroy him if you left. Charlotte closed her suitcase with finality, her heart breaking all over again. Then, he should have trusted me not to leave, she said softly. Instead, he's ensuring that I have no choice. As Charlotte carried her bags downstairs, she passed the French doors that led to the terrace, where Gabriel had first kissed her under the moonlight. Through the glass, she could see the hidden alcove where lavender would bloom in the spring, where Gabriel had planted something beautiful with his own hands. But beauty required nurturing to survive, and Gabriel Hartwell had just proven that he was too afraid to tend the love they had grown together. Charlotte only hoped that someday he would realize what he had thrown away, and that when he did, it wouldn't be too late to find his way back to her. 5 days passed like a grey winter storm, endless, cold, and unforgiving. Gabriel maintained his judicial schedule with mechanical precision, presiding over cases with the same sharp intellect that had made his reputation. But colleagues noticed the change in him, the way his usual controlled demeanor had hardened into something that seemed carved from stone. Mrs. Harper moved through Hartwell House like a woman in mourning, her disapproval radiating from every perfectly maintained room that felt more like a mausoleum now that Charlotte was gone. She served Gabriel's meals with pointed silence and arranged fresh flowers in Charlotte's empty bedroom with the persistence of someone maintaining a shrine. Gabriel told himself this was better, cleaner. Their arrangement had returned to its original practical parameters, free from the complications that emotional entanglement inevitably brought. He told himself this so often that he almost believed it, until the moments when he found himself reaching for Charlotte's hand at dinner, or looking for her smile across the breakfast table. It was Tuesday evening when everything changed. Gabriel was reviewing case files in his study when Mrs. Harper knocked on the door with unusual urgency. "Judge Hartwell," she said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "There's been an incident. Mrs. Hartwell was attacked outside the courthouse this afternoon." Gabriel's blood turned to ice. The case files scattered as he rose, his chair hitting the wall behind him with enough force to leave a mark. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "3 men," Mrs. Harper explained, her hands wringing the dish towel she still carried. "They tried to rob her, but when they realized who she was—" She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "They said they were sending you a message. The judges who interfere with their business should learn to control their families." Gabriel was moving before Mrs. Harper finished speaking, grabbing his car keys and coat with the kind of focused urgency that had nothing to do with judicial composure and everything to do with primal terror. "Where is she?" "Charleston General. Sarah called an hour ago. She's conscious, but—" Mrs. Harper's voice trailed off in a way that suggested details Gabriel wasn't prepared to hear. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of traffic lights and mounting panic. Gabriel found himself bargaining with whatever deity might be listening, offering anything, his career, his fortune, his life, in exchange for Charlotte's safety. The realization that he could lose her, really lose her, cut through every careful defense he had built around his heart. He found Charlotte in room 314, the same room where he had been treated after his own attack, sitting up in the narrow hospital bed with a butterfly bandage, covering a cut on her temple and her left wrist in a splint. She was pale but alert, her amber eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been relief when she saw him standing in the doorway. "Gabriel?" she said softly, and the sound of his name on her lips nearly brought him to his knees. "Charlotte." Gabriel crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands hovering over her face as if he was afraid she might disappear if he touched her. "My God, what did they do to you?" "I'm fine," Charlotte said quickly, though Gabriel could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the careful way she held herself that suggested hidden injuries. "A sprained wrist, some bruises, nothing serious." Gabriel's eyes catalogued every visible mark, every sign that someone had dared to lay hands on the woman he loved. His jaw tightened with a rage so pure it was almost cleansing. "Who were they?" "The police think they're connected to the Morrison drug case you're hearing next week," Charlotte replied, her voice steady despite everything. "They wanted to send you a message about judicial interference." Gabriel felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. "They used you to threaten me," he said quietly, the words carrying a weight of fury that made Charlotte's breath catch. "Gabriel," Charlotte began, but he cut her off with a shake of his head. "This is my fault," Gabriel said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. "I let you leave. I let you walk away without protection because I was too much of a coward to admit that I love you." Charlotte's eyes widened at his words. "Gabriel—" "I lied," Gabriel continued, the words pouring out of him like a dam had burst. "When I said loving you was a mistake, when I told you it was just proximity and convenience, I lied about all of it. I was terrified, Charlotte, terrified of how much I need you, how completely you've changed everything I thought I knew about myself." Gabriel dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed, his hands finally coming up to frame Charlotte's face with infinite care. "I've spent my entire life believing that love was weakness, that caring about someone gave them the power to destroy you. But losing you has taught me that the real weakness is being too afraid to fight for what matters." Tears were streaming down Charlotte's face now, but her eyes were bright with something that looked like hope. "You hurt me," she said softly. "When you said those things, when you made me feel like what we shared meant nothing—" "I know," Gabriel said, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "I know, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for it if you'll let me. I love you, Charlotte. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you see good in people who don't deserve it. I love the way you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be." Charlotte's hand came up to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "Gabriel," she said quietly, "I love you too. Even when I was angry, even when I thought you didn't want me, I never stopped loving you." Gabriel felt something tight in his chest finally loosen, as if he had been holding his breath for days and could finally exhale. "Come home with me," he said quietly. "Let me take care of you the way I should have from the beginning. Let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." Charlotte's smile was radiant despite her injuries, transforming her bruised face into something that took Gabriel's breath away. "Yes," she said simply. "Take me home." As Gabriel gently helped Charlotte from the hospital bed, supporting her carefully as they prepared to leave, he made a silent vow that no one would ever threaten what they had again. Charlotte was his wife, his love, his entire world, and he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of the gift she had given him. The man who had been too afraid to love was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the greatest courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. And Gabriel Hartwell was ready to be courageous for the woman who had taught him that love was not weakness, but the strongest force in the universe. Outside the hospital, snow was beginning to fall, covering Charleston in a blanket of white that made everything seem new and full of possibility. Gabriel helped Charlotte into the car with infinite care, his hand never leaving hers as they drove home through the quiet streets toward the life they would build together. A life based not on practical arrangements or careful distance, but on the kind of love that could weather any storm. 3 months later, Charlotte stood in the kitchen of Hartwell House, one hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, the other holding a carefully wrapped gift that contained the most important news of her life. The late March afternoon was warm with the promise of spring, and through the window she could see the lavender garden that Gabriel had planted for her, blooming in purple splendor. Their marriage had transformed completely since that night in the hospital, when Gabriel had finally admitted his fears and claimed his love. Gone was the careful distance, the formal politeness that had characterized their early months together. In its place was a warmth and intimacy that made even Mrs. Harper smile as she witnessed their obvious devotion to each other. Gabriel had become openly affectionate, no longer hiding his feelings behind professional composure. He touched Charlotte constantly, his hand finding hers during dinner, fingers tracing her shoulder as he passed her chair, stolen kisses in hallways that left them both breathless and laughing. He was courting her with the dedication of a man who had found his purpose, and Charlotte had never been happier. The front door opened with its familiar heavy sound, followed by Gabriel's voice calling her name. "Charlotte, I'm home." "In the kitchen," Charlotte called back, her heart doing the same little skip it always did when Gabriel returned from court. Some things, she had learned, never lost their magic. Gabriel appeared in the doorway, already loosening his tie with movements that had become deliciously familiar. His grey eyes brightened when they found her, and the smile that curved his mouth was soft with genuine happiness. "How was your day?" Gabriel asked, crossing the kitchen to wrap his arms around her from behind. His lips found the sensitive spot behind her ear that always made her shiver, and Charlotte leaned back against his solid strength with a contentment that still amazed her. "Productive," Charlotte said, turning in his arms to face him. "I have something for you." Gabriel's eyebrows rose with interest. "It's not my birthday." "No," Charlotte agreed, her heart racing with anticipation. "But it's still a celebration." She handed him the wrapped package, watching as Gabriel's careful fingers made quick work of the ribbon and paper. Inside was a leather-bound book titled Fatherhood with Grace, a guide to raising extraordinary children. Gabriel stared at the book for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally looked up at Charlotte, his grey eyes were bright with something that might have been wonder. "Charlotte," Gabriel said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" Charlotte nodded, tears of happiness already starting to fall. "I'm pregnant, Gabriel. About 8 weeks along." Gabriel set the book carefully on the counter and then swept Charlotte into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen with a joy so pure it made them both laugh. When he set her down, his hands immediately went to her still flat stomach, covering it with protective reverence. "A baby," Gabriel said, his voice filled with awe. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Charlotte asked, though Gabriel's radiant expression had already answered her question. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Gabriel replied, leaning down to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke of overwhelming love. "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted. Love, family, a future worth building. Now you're giving me a child to share it all with." Charlotte felt fresh tears at his words. "You're going to be an amazing father, Gabriel. You're going to love this baby the way you've learned to love me, completely, protectively, with everything you have." Gabriel's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted quietly. "A family, children, someone who loved me enough to trust me with something so precious." "Well, you do," Charlotte said firmly, her hands coming up to frame his face. "You have me, and you're going to have our baby, and we're going to build something beautiful together." That evening they sat on the terrace overlooking the lavender garden, Charlotte curled against Gabriel's side as they planned their future together. They talked about names and nurseries, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about all the ways their child would be lucky to grow up surrounded by so much love. "I want to do this right," Gabriel said quietly, his hand tracing gentle circles on Charlotte's stomach. "I want to be the kind of father who shows up, who stays, who loves unconditionally." "You will be," Charlotte said with absolute certainty. "You've already shown me that you know how to love without reservation. Our child will never doubt how much you care." Gabriel was quiet for a moment, his grey eyes reflecting the soft glow of the string lights Charlotte had hung throughout the garden. "I love you," he said finally, the words carrying the weight of absolute truth. "More than I thought it was possible to love someone. You saved me, Charlotte. You taught me that love isn't weakness, it's the strongest force in the universe." Charlotte smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "You saved me too," she said softly. "You gave me a home, a family, a love worth fighting for. You taught me that the best things in life are worth waiting for, worth nurturing, worth protecting." As the evening settled around them, Gabriel pulled Charlotte closer, his hands protective over their growing family. The lavender bloomed around them in purple abundance, filling the air with its sweet scent, and Charlotte thought about how perfectly it represented their love, something that had been planted with faith, nurtured with patience, and had bloomed into something more beautiful than either of them had dared to imagine. "Forever," Gabriel said quietly, the word carrying the weight of a vow. "Forever," Charlotte agreed, sealing their promise with a kiss that tasted of love and possibility and all the beautiful tomorrows that stretched ahead of them. In the distance, Heartwell House stood solid and welcoming, no longer a museum, but a home filled with laughter and love and the promise of new life. And somewhere in its elegant rooms, Mrs. Harper was probably already planning a nursery, her practical heart full of joy for the family that had finally learned to embrace the love they deserved. Gabriel and Charlotte Hartwell had begun their marriage as strangers bound by necessity, but they had discovered something far more precious in the careful space between them. They had found forever. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.